All right, good Thursday morning to you. Hope everything's going well for you. And grab your Bible this morning, and we'll jump right into the 10th Psalm. We'll be picking up in the 12th verse, Psalm 10, the 12th verse. We've been looking at this psalm for a couple of days now, and again, it starts out. The kind of the overarching question is David is wondering, where is God? Where is God in a time of trouble? And we discussed how David's problem was he was looking at things from his perspective. And then David goes into a lengthy description of a wicked or lawless man that John Phillips, in his commentary on this passage, points out ultimately is a description of the Antichrist, but in the interim is a description of evil men, wicked men. I told you as we started on the psalm that just to give you a heads up that there wasn't going to be an answer to the question when we get done. And there's not an answer to the question, but perhaps an answer for the question. What we see in this last section is somewhat David's actions, David's attitude as he contemplates kind of the problem of evil, the problem of wickedness, and what he perceives to be a lack of concern or involvement by God. And so to that, as we pick up in this last section, David now is, I kind of like the heading again. You see me glance down, I'm looking at my Bible online here on my laptop. And so it's not an actual paper version of the Bible, and so yours could say anything else. But this section gives us the heading here that's given in this particular on this particular screen, I guess you'd say, is he prays for a cure of these evils. And so while David doesn't have an answer here to his question of God, where are you? Why aren't you more involved in what's going on? And again, the little heading over the first section is David complains to God of the outrages of the wicked. And again, he goes on and details in great detail what those outrages of the wicked are. And so he comes to this point now where he prays for a cure for these evils, is the heading again in this Bible on this section. And so he begins by praying a phrase we've seen before: "Arise, O Lord." And I read that, and I think that to me, the picture I have that David is thinking, the kind of the image in his mind is that God is, and I kind of hate to put words in David's mouth, but to a certain extent, that's what we preachers do. We look at a text and try to figure out what the original author was saying, and then move that and say, okay, what difference does it make for us today? And what I see when I see David make this statement, "Arise, O Lord," it's almost as if David is saying, God, you've been sitting idly by. God, you've been sitting off to the side. It's time for you to get up and get in the game. It's time for you to get involved. This is beyond my power. This is beyond our man's earthly ability, and so I need you to get involved in what's going on here, and I need you to be part of the solution. And so he says, "Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thy hand, forget not the humble." And so I think you can see to a certain degree there, David's attitude, David's response here, as he's saying to God, "Arise, lift up your hand." In other words, do something. And forget not the humble, and so he's and by humble he's not talking about those that, and we've talked about this word before. He's not talking about those who lack pride. He's talking about here when he's talking about humble in this passage, in this way, he's talking about the oppressed, the downtrodden. And so in this first statement, David is basically saying, "Lord, you need to get up and get involved in what's going on here." And that's a very easy thing for us to do sometimes, is to get pushed to the place where it seems that God is not involved. That God's off handling something else, that he's busy. Sometimes it kind of feels that way to us. Again, in our hearts, we know that's not the case, but it's just how we sometimes feel. And so what does David begin praying for? He prays, "Lift up your hand, forget not the humble." And so what do we do? What is the answer for trouble and evil on earth? What do we, I told you there wasn't an answer to it, but perhaps an answer for it. And so the first thing David does is he calls on God. That may seem like a duh answer, so to speak. David, he just does the only thing he knows to do. He calls out, he cries out to God and begs God for help. He switches very quickly. It's almost as if David here in this description of evil, in these last, in these first 11 verses here, has come to the point where he's just overwhelmed with the magnitude of the wicked, and so he switches and says, listen, these people are so wicked. The only thing I know to do is to call on God to arise, to quit sitting on the sidelines, to get involved. I mean, that's the way again David felt at this point, that God was that God was just not paying any attention. Lift up your hand, forget not the humble. Some interpret that write about this psalm, that phrase of "lift up your hand," instead of is kind of the idea of raising your hand up to strike. Lord, strike these people. Don't just allow them to continue to abuse and to take to abuse the oppressed. And so David says, "Wherefore doth the wicked condemn God? He has said in his heart, thou wilt not require it." And so David, the second thing that David does here is David is saying, "I don't get it." Again, I think we've talked about this already. I don't think there's a problem with telling God, "I don't understand." David says, "What in the world's going on? How can the wicked condemn or come against God?" He said in his heart, "Thou wilt not require." In other words, he says the wicked man has said God's gonna do. Not going to do anything. And David, like you and I, we have a hard time. Sometimes I look at people and I see their actions, like you probably do. I see things on the news, or I hear things or see things, and I'm like, ooh, you kind of cringe because you're thinking, man, I wouldn't have done that, and from a point of, boy, I wouldn't have challenged God. I wouldn't have, I wouldn't have, went against God in that way. It's almost as if David feels like we do. that it's almost like sometimes the wicked of this world basically spit in the face of God and do whatever they please. And so David just says, Lord, I don't understand. I don't understand why, how they can act the way they do. And I don't understand how you allow it. And I think, most of us, we may not, want to stand up in church and admit it, but I think, on our own, we have to admit that, again, that we see things, we see people, we see their actions, and sometimes we just we're left speechless. How can they do that? How can God allow that? And that's where David is. For thou hast seen it, is what David says in the next verse. God, I know you saw it. I know you saw what they did. It's kind of like you ever been going down the road and where for me, I almost any time I go anywhere, it involves getting on 85 either north or south from my house. And many times, if you travel 85 in Cabarrus County, that many times there are somewhere along that little stretch between Concord and Kannapolis, there's highway patrolmen sitting on the road. And there's been plenty of times when I was going down the road, and I know the speed I was doing, and I get past, and it seems like, I get past like I'm not even moving, and they'll go right past the patrolman, and, you think, well, I'm fixing to see blue, and the patrolman doesn't move. He just sits there. And I keep watching in my rearview mirror, thinking he's coming any minute now. Surely he's, I know he had to see the man. I know he had to see that car go by him that fast. Why isn't he doing anything? And that's kind of what David says. Lord, I know you. All those things I just described about the wicked people in those other 10 verses. I know you see it. For thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thy hand. The poor committeth himself unto thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless. And David says, Lord, I'm counting on you. I'm putting my trust in you, that these wicked that just continue in their evil. And we can take that and we can take some comfort from David's statement. God does see. He sees the wicked, and he does, as David says. He says, "You requite it with thy hand. You do, you do bring judgment. The poor commits himself to you. Thou art a helper of the fatherless." God, I know, based on your word, that you are a helper, a defender of the oppressed, of the weak, of the poor. And so we're depending on you. You've heard how I've described the wickedness, and Lord, we're counting on you to intervene. Break thou the arm of the wicked and evil man. Seek out his wickedness till thou find none. There are what are called imprecatory psalms. And those are psalms that are just completely filled with phrases like this one: break his arm, knock out his teeth, those kind of things. So this is kind of an imprecatory verse in this psalm. And what David is saying is that somebody with a broke arm, if my arm's broke, I can't hit you. And so David is saying to God for asking him to make the wicked man, the evil man, break his arm where he can't do any more wickedness. Make it where he's unable to hurt anybody else. In other words, God's saying, David is saying, God, you're the only one that can stop the wicked. We need you to step in and intervene and do something. The Lord is king forever and ever, and the heathen are perished out of his hand. And so David is he's just putting everything. He's saying, God, as bad as the wicked were or are, as bad as I've described them, I know that you are greater. I have all the confidence, God, all the wickedness I described. I believe that you will still reign, that you are still the king. And so David says, I believe that you will take care of the situation. And then finally here, he wraps up here in verse 17 with, Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. Thou wilt prepare their heart. Thou wilt cause thine ear to hear. And so, it may not be, if you read the first 11 verses, you may read them and think, boy, David's lost all faith. David's lost all hope. But you get down, it's a good thing we have the rest of this psalm, because we get to the end of it and see that David is clearly still putting his trust in God. Again, I told you this psalm wasn't going to answer the question, but it was going to give us an answer for the question. I hope that makes sense. David still doesn't know why evil is allowed. He still doesn't know why it happens, but he knows what will happen. And so he says, Lord, I'm trusting you. You are, he says, you've heard me. He says, you've already heard what I say. You will, look at those present tense, future tense words. You have heard. Now, you will prepare. You will cause your ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, and the man of the earth may no more oppress. And so David, here in these last verses, is saying, Lord, I still don't understand evil. I still don't understand where it comes from and why it's what it is. But Lord, I know this, that you are still in absolute control. And so as we wrap up this psalm that, again, really doesn't in one way answer the question of God's silence. Why isn't God speaking up and saying something? Again, we don't have, what one person said, we don't have an explanation but an exhortation. We still don't know why, but we are encouraged to trust God. We know his character. We know who he is. We know how he is. And to remember, and we should be thankful ourselves that in every situation, God doesn't bring justice immediately. If he did, all of us, every one of us, myself, you, everyone who's listening, watching on this video, every one of us, we don't want God to have that kind of courtroom. We want him to have that kind of courtroom for somebody else. And so what we have here is David reminding us that, yes, there is evil. Yes, there is wickedness, but the day is come. There is a time coming when God will step in, and he will intervene. He will exercise his judgment, and so we have that confidence. And so as you go out, as this week winds down, if you go to work, if you go out in public, if you turn on the news, you're going to hear of evil, wicked men, and you'll hear it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day till Jesus comes. But here's what David tells us. As again we read later in the New Testament when it says, be sure your sins will find you out. We know that God is still, as David says, God, you still see, you know what's going on. And God, I'm going to trust you to judge even when I don't understand. All right, hope you have a great day, that it'll all go well, and you'll remember that God still sees. Have a great day.